come from our Creator. We believe in natural, nature's God, natural law, common law. And I know that Harriet is a strong believer in that, and she's a strong defender of that as well. Harriet her practice includes covering issues from water rights, private property rights, natural resources issues, and taken on the EPA and has successfully won that battle in court. One of the best things about Harriet that you might not know is that she has a whole bunch of nieces and nephews that think she is the best aunt in the whole wide world. They adore her. And she's also the little sister to Jim Hageman, one of our most wonderful, faithful Campaign for Liberty supporters. So Harriet and Jim, that's his little sister. And then the best thing about Harriet is she just has a heart of gold, and she's just a very, very courageous woman in all that she does. And so I would like to welcome Harriet.
Thank you. Bar none, that was absolutely the best introduction I've ever had in my life. Thank you. That was very, very sweet. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. I am not a microphone person, as you can probably tell from my voice, and so if I don't have to use that, I would prefer not to. And at any point during the course of this, if I start talking too low, raise your hand, yell at me, and I will speak up. So we have plenty of time to get through our stuff tonight, and there are a lot of familiar faces here. I'm very glad to see some of you, and I actually have to ask the question of why you would come back to hear this horrible story that I'm about to tell, because there's going to be a lot of information about what's going on with our government. And I appreciate you being here. I will let you know that I have updated my information pretty dramatically since the last time I spoke to the Liberty Group, and I don't know when that was, 4 years ago maybe? 3 or 4 years ago, so there's a lot of information. I wanted to point something out, though, that I don't normally do, but Kathy raised this issue, and I think it's very important for us to be reminded of this. One of the things that a lot of people don't pay a lot of attention to is our Wyoming Constitution. And I'm somebody who feels very strongly about our Wyoming Constitution. What many people don't realize is that the federal Constitution and our rights that are identified in the federal Constitution, that's essentially a floor. But the states have the right to grant broader liberties, broader freedoms, if you will. The states have the right, the states when they became states, they had the right to adopt their own constitution. And I'm somebody who harps on this pretty extensively because I don't think that we're educating our young well enough about not only the federal constitution, but our state constitution as well. And in light of what Kathy said about people not understanding that our rights come from God rather than the government, I think it's very significant. It's a very significant point, and it's important to go back to what our forefathers said. This is the preamble to the Wyoming Constitution. We, the people of the state of Wyoming, grateful to God for our civil, political, and religious liberties, and desiring to secure them to ourselves and perpetuate them to our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution. Grateful to God for our civil, political, and religious liberties. And the only reason that the Constitution was established and that our state was established was to protect those rights that are innate in us. I think the significance of that and where I feel that there's been a real breakdown, if you will, in educating our young on that very important point is if our rights come from government, government can take them away. Correct. We are the first government, we're the first political body in the history of the world that recognize that we are born with civil liberties and that we do not have to ask the government for them. I'm obviously speaking to the choir. You know that, and that's very heartening to see all the people who recognize this and understand it, because I can assure you there are many places I go that is a revelation. They don't know that. They don't understand it. I think it's significant. Kathy, thank you for bringing that up. And I think that we'll just go ahead and get started with what I'm talking about today. This is called Regulation Without Representation. And I started, I hope this works.
Who's pizza, guys? Anybody who's hungry, there's food in the back room there. I'm not a bubblegum chewer by myself.
Did you want to bring that up? Is that better for you?
I don't know
Oh,
if
yeah.
there's another
No, that's
clicker
great.
for this. I can do this. Well, I'll tell you, obviously, the title of my presentation is a play on taxation without representation. And our forefathers believed that if they were going to be taxed by England, they should have a say in their government. And obviously, the folks in England had a different opinion about that. And so the rallying cry was taxation without representation. And they said that it wasn't fair that they have to pay money to the government, but have no say-so in how that government is operating. Well, the same thing is happening now, but it's happening through regulations, not just taxation. As Thomas Jefferson said, the two enemies of the people are criminals and government. So let us tie the second down with the chains of the Constitution so that the second will not become the legalized version of the first. He also said, when we must wait for Washington to tell us when to sow and when to reap, we shall soon want for bread. As a water and natural resource attorney, that rings true on so many different levels, because that's exactly what we see in things with the Department of Agriculture, especially at the federal level. Most of what I'm going to talk about tonight is about federal regulations. I'll talk a little bit about state regulations, but what you're going to learn from me tonight is that really it is that body back in Washington, D.C. that is exercising authority that it does not have, violating the Constitution as it does so, and affecting every one of our rights and our liberties and our freedom in the process. In other words, this is not a good situation, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. All right, let's talk about the financial situation as of September 6th and September 12th. And I put this up there, realizing it's a couple months ago, but I was talking to a couple of groups in September, and I talked to these two groups 6 days apart. What was interesting about that, and I know that these numbers are very small, but I can tell you what they are. As of September 6th, the federal government debt was $19,977 billion.
Yep.
As of July 20th, it was 19.965 trillion. As of June, it was 19.95 trillion. As of August 16th, 2013, just 4 years ago, it was $16.9 trillion. As of September 12th, just 6 days later, the debt jumped to $20,164 billion. It was an increase of $187 billion in 6 days. What happened in those 6 days? They raised the debt ceiling. $187 billion in additional debt in a 6-day period. As of the 6th of September, that was $61,000 per citizen, and it was $165,000 per taxpayer. I think that that's a really significant number when you think about it and you think about the debt or the debate that's going on in Washington, D.C. right now, where our political leaders simply do not have the gumption, if you will, the political strength, the will, the integrity to recognize that we are overtaxed. And when you look at these numbers and you look at that debt per taxpayer, it really ought to give them pause when they talk about taking more and more of our money. And it also gives you an idea that there are a very limited number of taxpayers as compared to citizens.
Yep.
It's almost $480 billion in interest per year. It's over $15,000 in interest per second. I know, great numbers, right? Not a very good way to start out a speech, but that's what you have. The debt has increased over $10 trillion since 2009. All right, let's talk about some additional numbers. The total U.S. debt as of 9/6, $208,000 per citizen, $814,000 per family. The total U.S. debt at that time was $67 trillion. In the total unfunded liabilities as of September 6th, $107 trillion. Yes, $107 trillion out of Washington, D.C. Where are we today? As of 2 days ago, our debt is $20,471 billion. It's more than the yearly GDP. It's $62,000 per citizen, $169 per taxpayer. The total U.S. debt is $68 trillion, and unfunded liabilities is $108 trillion. Now, those are staggering numbers in and of themselves, but it's beyond that. Because what that is that represents Congress covering up really bad policy by deficit spending.
Yep.
Congress never has to tell anybody no, and we're watching this play out in real time. In fact, we watch it play out in real time almost every day. Congress is trying to figure out, how do we just get through another 2 years?
Yep.
How do we get through another 3 years? How do we get through until I want to retire? How do we cover up the fact that we're making really stupid decisions? Because if they weren't stupid decisions, we wouldn't have $107 trillion in unfunded liabilities and $20 trillion in debt. The Fish and Wildlife Service, in the recent past, funded a study studying shrimp on treadmills. We are $20 trillion in debt, and the United States Fish and Wildlife Service is studying shrimp on treadmills. I thought, well, that's dumb. That's just really, that's kind of out there. That's a pretty stupid thing to do. And then I recently learned that they were studying fish on treadmills, so it got even worse. That's what our federal government does, because what does that mean? That's votes. Those are grants. That's buying somebody. That's what those numbers are. They take our money away, and they use it to essentially buy votes and keep themselves in power.
Yep.
Where does the money go? I refer to this as the California model. The California example is this. You've all heard about the Californian drought, and you watched as some of their reservoirs overtopped and almost collapsed and failed earlier this year. California has the same water infrastructure in place today with 40 million people that it had in the 1960s with 16 million people. Let me repeat that. California has the same water infrastructure in place today that they had 50 years ago, and their population has more than doubled. That is a pure, unadulterated failure of leadership. They can be green because they're dumb. They can have bad policies and say, no new dams. Because then they lie to people and say, oh my God, it's global warming, it's a drought.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have the leadership skills or the will to actually do what they are supposed to be doing, which is providing services to their citizens. That is the government's only role in that regard. And what is one of the things that the government probably ought to do? Provide water to its citizens. We can talk about drought until the cows come home. If you don't expand your water infrastructure, you can't serve more people. It's very simple. This is not complicated. But California's spending money, they don't spend money on water infrastructure, just as the Federal Highway Administration does not spend money on highways, and the Department of Defense does not spend money on aircraft carriers. California's government, like the federal government and most other state and local governments, spends its money on salaries, benefits, pensions, and other forms of employee compensation. What are they doing? They're buying the votes. If they have the public employee unions supporting them at the federal level and at the state level, they get elected. It really is that simple. It is estimated that something between 1/2 and 80% of California's state and local spending ultimately goes to employee compensation.
Yep.
In other words, government for government's sake. But what does a regulator do? They regulate. And if they don't regulate, they're going to lose their job. So they have to find more and innovative ways to regulate us so that this entire scheme continues unabated. There are, obviously, everybody in this room knows this, but we can go back to 4th grade. We know that we have 3 branches of government. We have the executive, which are the president and the governors. We have the legislative, and we have the judicial. I'm going to set aside the judicial tonight, and I'm going to talk about the legislative and the executive. The executive is to do nothing but carry out the law that the legislative branch adopts. That's it. There really isn't any other purpose of the executive branch. They're not to make law. They're not to dictate policy. Whether it is the governor or it is the president, they are to carry out the laws that are on the books. That is their job. The legislature and Congress are to pass the laws. But who is the real governing class? In 2009, Congress passed 125 bills. There were over 3,500 regulations adopted in 2009. In 2010, Congress passed 217 bills. There were 3,573 regulations adopted by executive agencies. Let's go down to 2013. Congress passed 72 new laws. There were 3,659 new regulations, 51 regulations adopted by the executive branch for every law passed by Congress. They issued a new rule in 2013 every 2.5 hours. In 2015, Congress passed 114 new laws, 3,410 new regs, and 2016, I'm going to talk about a little bit more later. That was the record. That was the record, and you know why. And that's because there was an election a year ago that went a little bit sideways for some people, and they had to do whatever they could to get regulations passed. In 2016, Congress passed 214 new laws. There were 3,853 new regulations, a ratio of 18 regulations to every single law passed. Here's the significance of that. All of those regulations have the full force and effect of law. If I violate a regulation, I can go to prison. I can be fined substantial amounts of money violating a regulation. In fact, in working with these agencies, the agencies focus much more on the language of the regulations because they wrote it than they do on the language of the law. And that's one of the run-ins that I've had with the federal government over the years in the cases I've tried, is I say, this is what the statute says. This is it. This is what controls. Your regulation does not control. This is what controls. And they say, yeah, well, we don't really like that.
Wish you quit moving around.
We like the regulations. They explain it better. The regulations are what need to be enforced. The regulations are what we need to use when we need to instruct the jury. Don't use the language of the law. Don't use the language of the statute. Let's instead use the regulation adopted by the EPA, and that's how the jury should be instructed. Those are some of the battles that I have as a practicing attorney. Problem is, agencies don't answer to you. You all know that. You know that if you need to get a hold of somebody in the EPA, or the Fish and Wildlife Service, or the Department of Ag, or the Department of Education, or the Department of Transportation, or the Department of Labor, no matter what it is, you won't. You could call and say, you know what, that regulation that you guys adopted was really, really bad, and I'm not going to follow it. And they're like, yeah, you will. I was reading just today and preparing for tonight that no one even knows how many executive branch agencies there are. The estimates range from 60, which is not true, to 438 federal agencies. There are 53,838 final regulations that have been adopted between 2001 and 2014. Only 160 of which, 0.3%, actually received a cost-benefit analysis. They don't even know how many agencies there are, yet we're funding them. They don't even know what regulations are being adopted, but we're required to comply with them, and they don't even know whether there's any benefit to the regulations, but they're adopting them anyway. Absolutely horrific business model, if you ask me. Very worst thing you can do. But here's what's important, and here's what I have figured out. This allows our elected officials to not be responsible for their decisions.
Yep.
This allows them to say, I know that we need to address X, Y, and Z in terms of education reform. But if we have to vote on that, I'm going to make my voters mad. And I may not get reelected. So if the agencies adopt these as regulations, then I can step back and I can say, those darn agencies, look at what these agencies do. Listen to our political leaders rail against these agencies. You hear it every day. You hear it. I hear it about the EPA. I hear it about the Department of Transportation. I hear our congressional representatives complain about those agencies and their authority almost every day. But who has the authority to do something about it? Congress does. Congress does. But by doing this, they are not being held accountable for what they should be. We are taking the representative out of our republic. We are a republic. We are not a democracy. I know all of you know that. But it is very important to say that over and over again, because we are a representative form of government. When you vote for someone, they are to represent you. When agencies are the ones doing the rulemaking, they are representing the agency. They are representing the politics. They are representing the executive branch. They are not representing the citizens of this country. They are not following our Constitution and acknowledging that our rights come from God and not from them. Several years ago, I was at a meeting in Salt Lake City, and we were working on a pipeline issue, and we were working with the Bureau of Reclamation, and they said, we love this idea. This is a great project. We're going to have to do an EIS, an environmental impact statement, which can be horrifically expensive. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions. This one would probably cost over $1 billion. And we're sitting in the room, and they shoved a piece of paper across the desk and said, we want to move forward with this as quickly as we can. And I said, well, what's the piece of paper? And they said, you need to sign this. And I said, well, I'm not signing anything. I'm just the attorney. But I said, what is the piece of paper? And they said, this is saying that you will fund the EIS. Your group will fund the EIS. Well, by statute, it's the agency that conducts the environmental impact statement. That's what the National Environmental Policy Act says. It's the agency that does the EIS. These agencies are self-funding, and it's why they're not even accountable to Congress anymore. And I initially thought, you know, if we're the project proponents, maybe it makes some sense for us to pay rather than that being for taxpayers. Why would the taxpayers pay for that? And then you think about it. If we're funding an agency to the tune of tens of millions or hundreds of millions or whatever it is, what incentive do they ever have to finish that EIS? They have every incentive to make that EIS cost as much as possible and every incentive to make that EIS last as long as possible, because during that entire period we are paying the salaries of federal employees. We are actually, the citizens are now directly paying the salaries and the expenses and the costs and overhead of these agencies. So, they don't even have to answer to Congress. I was wondering, why in the world can they call in the EPA and the EPA says, we're not coming in. I mean, Congress will have a hearing and say, we want the head of the EPA to come in and testify. And they're like, no, we're not coming in. We're not going to talk to you. We don't have to. This is why. They don't have to, because they're getting their funds directly from the citizens, which is another hidden tax. So we're not just talking about an effective rate of 35% or 40% or 27% or whatever the number is. There are people who are paying substantial taxes funding these agencies out of their own pockets. Redundancy. We have an EPA. We have the Department of Environmental Quality. We have the Department of Transportation at the federal level and at the state level. We have the Department of Education at the state and at the federal. We have Department of Labor, federal, state, Department of Ag, federal, state. Why? Why? Maybe that gives you some hint as to why we're $20 trillion in debt at the national level. We don't need all these agencies. The states are where the power is supposed to reside in our form of government. The federal government was always supposed to be of limited power. And what I see states doing anymore is states look at themselves and they say, give us money, please give us more money. We need more money from the federal government. No, we need to stop that. That money is ours. We've got to stop laundering money through Washington, D.C. We need to keep that money in the state of Wyoming, and in Florida, and Texas, and California. We should not be sending 40% of our income to Washington, D.C. for them to dole it back to us as a political favor. It isn't their money to dole, it's our money, and the states need to start demanding that. That is where the power should reside in this country, and our governors need to be fighting that battle and fighting it every single day. We've got to bring that power back to the states. We've got to suck that power out of D.C., bring it here. I don't want to be California. I don't live in California. As long as Washington, D.C. is dictating the policies, and they have 40 million people in California, then I have to live in a state like California because that's what they make me do. That is wrong. If California wants to make stupid decisions, I'm really cool with that. I'm okay with that. But it shouldn't affect me in Wyoming. It should not affect how I wash my dishes, which there's rules on that. It should not affect how I educate my child. It should not affect how we fund our highways. Yet that's exactly what is going on because of what's happening in D.C. Costly. I mean, federal regulations, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, National Forest Management Act, and then you have all your state regulations. And now you see state agencies, and they act as though they are arms of the federal government. That's another thing that we need to change that dynamic. When a federal agency comes into the state of Wyoming, they are here as our guests. We need to recognize that our DEQ folks have the same rights and authorities as the EPA, and in fact probably more. Under our form of constitution, they should have more. I actually get along pretty well with the Department of Environmental Quality. If I've got somebody who receives a notice of violation, a gravel company or a construction company, they receive a notice of violation from the DEQ, I can call them up and say, hey, what about this? What's going on? Can we work something out here, or I think you're wrong, or let's talk about this. There is no discussion with the EPA. The EPA has turned into an agency that does nothing but punish, and they don't care about the environment. They flat don't care, because it is about power, it is about money. So finally, President Obama in 2001, he announced that there would be a government-wide review of the rules already on the books to remove outdated regulations that stifle job creation and make our economy less competitive. This was music to my ears. I was really excited to see that President Obama was going to do this. So let's see how he did. As of 2011, there were an additional 82,419 pages of new regulations and notices. An additional 119 million additional hours of paperwork to comply with the new regulations, and 0 economically significant rules repealed. January 2012, 374 days since the executive order. In that first 27 days of January 2012, an additional $7.7 billion in additional regulatory costs against our country. Another 4,500 pages in the Federal Register, and an additional 25.3 million hours of annual paperwork to comply. As of June 22nd, though, 521 days since the President's executive order, and guess what? They repealed one rule. Milk is no longer considered an oil spill. This stuff's so absurd, I can't even make it up. Don't cry over it. Don't cry over it. The Federal Register. 2016 finished the year with a record high 95,894 pages, 19% higher than 2015. 38,000 pages are the Federal Register. That's what this is where rules are published. Proposed rules, final rules, notices. This is the Federal Register right here. Tells you what agencies do. This is the very first one ever published. This is number 1, 1936, Roosevelt New Deal. This is where regulations started. How many months of regulations do you think this is? 9 months. 9 months of regulations, 1936, number 1. This book is from 2013. How many months?
1.
1 week. 1 week. 1 day. This is what is coming out of our federal government. And it's not only bad that it's wasting all of this paper and all of the absurd rules that come with it. Every one of those rules have an impact on our freedoms, on our liberty, on our autonomy, on our state's ability to govern, on our budget, on our economy, everything. These rules have real, live impacts to every single one of us. And it's a hidden tax. It is a hidden tax. In 2014, 79,000 pages. 2015, 80,000 pages. 2012, 77,000 pages. Among the 10 all-time highs, 7 of them were under President Obama. 7 of the 10 highest page counts. There have been 195,000 rules since the Federal Register began itemizing them in 1976. You know, this is just something to show how bizarre this is. The First Amendment, 45 words. The Lord's Prayer, 66 words. The 10 Commandments, 179 words. The Gettysburg Address, 286 words. The Declaration of Independence, 1,300. The United States government regulations on cabbage crop insurance, 3,500 words. The U.S. Constitution, 7,800 words. The U.S. government regulations on special rules for experimental populations of threatened and endangered wildlife and plants, over 36,000 words. Obamacare regulations, 8 times longer than the Bible. Rules implementing the Dodd-Frank financial reform law could fill 28 copies of Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace. 13,789 pages of regulations for Dodd-Frank. Do you think that any of this is to our benefit? No. We don't even know what's in those rules, but we do know that there are a lot of attorneys and lobbyists in Washington, D.C. that knows what are in those regulations. And what these are it's a protectionist racket. That's what this is about. I was visiting with some bankers here in Wyoming. There were 2 rules that were pending at the end of the Obama administration, and I think that they're still pending. I don't know where they are right now. He said if those 2 rules pass, it will be the end of all small banks. Because the paperwork is going to be so extreme, you will not be able to keep up with it. You want to know what the paperwork is about? It's data mining. It isn't about providing better services. It isn't about making sure that you have an affordable mortgage. It isn't to make sure that we can support our ranchers and our farmers. What is it? It's about data mining. Send us every minutia of information that you can about our citizens. Age, sex, children, and on and on and on. It's our federal government data mining banks to get information about the citizens. And frankly, I don't really want the federal government to have all that information. What do they need it for? What do they need it for? Are people dying in the street because the federal government doesn't have this information? Of course not. Are people dying in the street before Dodd-Frank was adopted and before the regulations went into place? Were people dying in the street prior to Obamacare? No. This is about amalgamating power in D.C. This is about taking power away from the citizens and making sure that there is a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. that can dictate how we live our lives. The federal worker safety laws include some 4,000 rules dictating precisely what equipment will be used and how facilities are built. One of the rules states that stairwells or stairways shall be lit by natural or artificial illumination. What's my other option?
Yeah.
We have people writing regulations telling builders that they have to put illumination in their stairwells. And what's troublesome about that to me is this. They have such disdain for the citizens of this country that they don't think that our builders know that. I'm not a builder, and I'm going to figure out pretty doggone quickly that I have to have light in my stairwells. I'm going to figure that out, and I'm not even a builder. We have federal regulations that dictate that. That's kind of scary. The number of healthcare reimbursement categories increased from 18,000 to 140,000. It includes 21 separate categories for spacecraft accidents and 12 for bee stings. Health reimbursement categories, 12 different categories for bee stings. What did I say earlier? If you're a regulator, you gotta regulate. This is the kind of stuff they're writing. There is a USDA regulation for magicians who use rabbits in their magic acts. You have to have an evacuation plan. And if you don't, you get fined. You think I'm kidding? The USDA requires, I gotta do something about it. I just collect. I collect and I collect and I collect all this stuff and I read it and I drive myself crazy. This is what they said. This gentleman was doing a magic show down in Texas, and when he got done, a woman who was a USDA enforcement officer came up and asked to see his written permit for his bunny and his evacuation plan. Well, he's a funny guy. He's a magician, you know. He's probably a comedian, so he starts joking with her and realized she wasn't kidding. So this is what he was required to have. A rabbit disaster plan had to be in place by July 29th, 2013. In case of calamity, flooding, earthquake, landslide, mudslide, avalanche, wildfire, intentional attack, and other reasons. But the bunnies, you can protect the bunnies.
You can make them disappear.
You know what he said? He said, look, if there's a tornado, we'll take the bunny with us. He's part of my act. He's money. He's money in my pocket. That wasn't good enough. He had to have a written disaster plan in place for his bunny. Now, the other thing that the USDA has done, and I think this is very important, is they've also issued guidelines for how to roast marshmallows. Okay, now take a bureaucrat to ruin roasting marshmallows. You have to have a stick that's at least 3 feet long, and you can't be under, I think it's 7 years old, and you have to have adult supervision at all times, and it's got this whole list of everything you're supposed to do, and then at the end, because you got to be nagged by your government, don't you? They said, think fruit. It's healthier. We are $20 trillion in debt, and we have the USDA telling us how to roast marshmallows. Truly, we have. We've got insane. The 5 most active rulemaking agencies, the IRS, probably shocks you there, Interior, Commerce, Transportation, and the EPA. They account for 43% of all federal rules. The Obama, his administration averaged 81 economically significant rules each year. What is an economically significant rule? One that is going to have a negative economic impact of $100 million at a minimum. At least $100 million. The Obama administration issued regulations that were worth $19 billion, $20 billion, $36 billion, $75 billion. You think about this. These are people who are completely unaccountable to all of us, and they are adopting regulations and imposing them against us worth billions and billions of dollars, and there was not 1 ounce of congressional oversight for any bit of that. Not one. Of the 3,297 rules in the pipeline as of the fall of 2015, months. As of the election on November 8th, they went into high gear. They had anticipated that Hillary Clinton was going to be the president. We all know that. And there were a lot of regulations that they had held back because they knew that they could potentially be politically damaging to her. So they'd held them in their back pocket, waiting until after the election, expecting that she would just implement them after the election was over. But once she was defeated, then they started shoving those things through. And I mean, I've got the numbers in here, but from November 9th until the end of December, it was absolutely Katie bar the door. They adopted massive numbers of regulations. I'll give you the specific numbers. In 1992, the regulatory costs in this country were $400 billion. As of last year, it was 1.94. In 2015, it was 1.948 trillion, and in 2016, it was 1.963 trillion dollars. $1,963 billion. I will use the terminology again. That is a hidden tax against every one of us. And I truly believe we are not going to get this economy rolling the way that it could and should. We are not going to be improving our wage situation. We are not going to be actually getting a real benefit in terms of improving our net economic situation until we address this. This is a huge drag on our economy. $1.963 trillion in 2016. In 2012, income taxes were over 1.1 trillion. But income taxes have to be disclosed. Regulations do not have to be disclosed unless they're going to have an impact of at least $100 million. Now, this may surprise you, but the agencies themselves self-report. And on average, they have found, when they've done any kind of an analysis, that the agencies underestimate the impact of their regulations by 40%. So every time that you hear of a regulation that is going to have an impact of $100 million, you can assume that it is going to have a minimum of $140 million impact on our economy, on our businesses. Combined, I just looked at federal spending 2 days ago. Our federal government is spending $4 trillion, over $4 trillion a year. As of the 7th of November, federal spending this year was $4 trillion. Receipts were $3.3 trillion. So right now we have a deficit just for this year of over $700 billion, and we're not even at the end of the year. In 2014, if U.S. regulations were a country, they would have been the 10th largest economy, ranked between India and Italy. And in 2016, it would be the 7th largest economy, ranked between India and Italy. It amounts to almost $15,000 per household per year. Here's the other problem, though, and this is where I have the battle with what I do as an attorney, is that they're not enforcing the statutes. They're not enforcing the law. They're interpreting the law. And I will read to you what the United States Supreme Court said about this in relation to the Clean Water Act. According to the U.S. Supreme Court, the burden of federal regulation on those who would deposit fill material in locations denominated as navigable waters of the United States. The EPA does not have jurisdiction of every water body. Only navigable waters of the United States. The states are responsible for all other water bodies. So the smaller waterways in Wyoming and elsewhere are to be managed and administered by the states, not the federal government. The federal government obviously recognizes the benefits and the value of our water resources. And so they are attempting to use the Clean Water Act to take jurisdiction over water quantity, and this is the way they're doing it. So I'll start that again. The burden of federal regulation on those who would deposit fill material in locations denominated navigable waters of the United States is not trivial. In deciding whether to grant or deny a permit, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers exercises the discretion of an enlightened despot, relying on such factors as economics, aesthetics, recreation, and in general the needs and welfare of the people. The average applicant for an individual permit spends 788 days and $271,596 in completing the process. And the average applicant for a nationwide permit, which by definition means there's no environmental impact, spends 313 days and $29,000, not counting the costs of mitigation. What was I telling you earlier? The agencies are self-funding, and this is how they do it. Over $1.7 billion is spent each year by the private and public sectors obtaining wetlands permits. These costs cannot be avoided because the Clean Water Act imposes criminal liability as well as steep civil fines of $37,500 per day on a broad range of ordinary industrial commercial activities. I represented a gentleman in a Clean Water Act case that he had moved an irrigation ditch and the EPA sued him. It was on private property, on his own lands. He affected 2.1 acres of land, actually improved the environment dramatically. And in fact, so improved the environment, I was not entitled to show the jury the end project. We were not allowed to show photographs of the project because of how beautiful it looked and what a beautiful job he did. The judge refused to allow me to show the end project, even though he was sued. At one time, he was facing fines of $65 million.
Andy Johnson.
For straightening an irrigation ditch on his own property. This is what the Supreme Court went on to say. The enforcement proceedings against Mr. Rapinos are a small part of the immense expansion of federal regulation of land use that has occurred under the Clean Water Act without any change in the governing statute during the past 5 presidential administrations. In the last 3 decades, the Corps and EPA have interpreted their jurisdiction over the navigable waters of the United States to cover 270 to 300 million acres of swampy lands in the United States, including half of Alaska and an area the size of California in the lower 48 states. And that was just the beginning. The Corps has also asserted jurisdiction over virtually any parcel of land containing a channel or conduit, whether man-made or natural, broad or narrow, permanent or ephemeral, through which rainwater or drainage may occasionally or intermittently flow. On this view, the federally regulated navigable waters of the United States include storm drains, roadside ditches, ripples of sand in the desert that may contain water once a year, and lands that are covered by floodwater once every 100 years. Because they include the land containing storm sewers and desert washes, the statutory navigable waters of the United States engulf entire cities and immense arid wastelands. In fact, the entire land area of the U.S. lies in some drainage basin, and an endless network of visible channels furrows the entire surface, containing water ephemerally wherever the rain falls. Any plot of land containing such a channel may potentially be regulated as a navigable water of the United States. Now, when Congress passed the Clean Water Act, do you think that was their intent? And if it is, let them pass a law. If this is what they want the EPA to do, let Congress have the guts to do it. Don't do it through these agencies, because what happens is it becomes completely arbitrary. It is enforced against one guy, but not the next one. And if you are going to have respect for the law has to apply the same to everybody. What are we seeing in this country right now in terms of the lawlessness and the anarchy? And it is a form of anarchy. I think that what happened with I shouldn't be political. Can I be political? Yes. Okay. I think that what happened with Hillary Clinton had a huge impact on the psychology of the people in this country. The fact that she was not prosecuted for what she did demonstrated so specifically about the fact that the law doesn't apply to some people. And I think that we are seeing it play out. I think it was a travesty of justice, and that is exactly what happens here. How do you have respect for the law when you have an EPA that has gone this crazy in attempting to enforce a statute or apply a statute? I remember we were in that case that I tried, I was meeting with the judge ahead of when we were going to tell the jury, give the instructions for the jury. And you have to come to, the judge has to decide what instructions to give. And so I rely on the law. I rely on the language of the statute. That's what I wanted him to read to the jury. The U.S. Attorney's Office came up with this absolute bizarre set of instructions. And I said, Judge, that isn't the law. And they said, but it should be. Oh, gosh. But it should be. This is how it should be interpreted. It was a 2.5-hour conference, and it was one of the bloodiest conferences. I mean, it was ugly. I shouldn't say bloody. It was just ugly. I mean, we fought, and we fought over those instructions. Because at one time, the judge had an instruction instructing the jury that if my client was sued by the EPA, he was guilty. Now, he withdrew that. He withdrew it at the last second. The judge did. But that's the kind of power that these U.S. attorneys have over federal district court judges. It is a very arbitrary situation when it is bureaucrats that are writing the law. The Obamacare law was 2,700 pages. The lawyers have drafted over 20,000 pages of regulations. There are in excess of 180 boards. There are 18 pages in that book to define what is a full-time employee. 18 pages used to describe and define a full-time employee. A regulator has to regulate. That's what they do. You know, Obamacare to me is such a perfect example of why concentrating all the power in D.C. is such a dangerous, dangerous, dangerous idea. And I will say dangerous. And I say that, I think of Obamacare as the worst computer virus that has ever existed. It permeated and infiltrated all aspects of our lives, and our agencies, and our states, and our counties, and our inner cities. It's just permeated everything. And I actually have some sympathy for the folks in Congress trying to rip that out, because the way they designed it was that you can't fix it. Everybody knows it is failing. The Democrats know it's failing. The Republicans know it's failing. Everybody knows its failings. It can't be fixed. It can't be fixed. If you do that on an individual state-by-state basis, you can take into consideration that state's culture, that state's population, that state's rural versus urban mix. You can take all of those things into consideration, and maybe you don't do anything at all. Maybe you say people buy their own insurance. That's just life. Maybe that's what you do. But when you do it on a federal level, and you do it to the extent that they did in Obamacare, it becomes impossible to fix when it fails. And I think about the people who are going to suffer. You think about our veterans. You think about what the Veterans Administration did to make those regulators look good. They didn't provide services to the very most important people in our country, the people who defend us. The people that we say, if you sign on this bottom line and you put on that uniform, we will give you certain benefits. We had regulators who said, I want to make myself look good, so the guy dies, it's okay. I'm comfortable with that. If that's the way they're going to run the VA, how are they going to run a single-payer system? How are they going to be able to run our healthcare system at all? We have 330 million people in this country. I was recently visiting with some women who wanted to do a documentary about conservatives, and they contacted me. They were from California, and they'd really not met many of us. They're kind of like poking me like I'm in a zoo or something. What is she going to do? Is she going to bite? It was a very interesting conversation. But they had done some research on my website, and I think that they had some knowledge about who I was. And they said, why are you so anti-government? And I said, I'm not anti-government. I said, I'm anti-bad government. And they said, well, why are you anti-federal government? And I said, I'm not anti-federal government. I said, I believe in the Constitution. I carry a Constitution in my purse. It's right over there. I believe in the Wyoming Constitution. I said, I very much believe in our form of government. I very much believe in our government. But I said, well, I'm going to ask you a question. What does our federal government do well?
Not a whole hell of a lot if you ever watched a senator or
it was very quiet, and then she finally said, defense. And I said, you're right, and I agree with you. But that's one of the only things it's supposed to do. Defense, protect our borders, those are the things it's supposed to do. I said, set that aside. Tell me what else it does well. And they didn't have an answer. Now I'm going to say this. I have met a lot of federal employees that I think are really good federal employees. And I think that they really do have their hearts in the right places. I've actually cross-examined some federal employees that I like. They don't like me, but I like them. I think they try to do a pretty good job. But it's the policies out of Washington, D.C. that dictate what they can do. And that's the problem. I think that there are some very good federal employees, but there are a lot of bad federal laws. And if we can get that power out of DC and return that power to the states, some of those federal employees may go to work with the state. They may stay in our state. They may be able to help us to do what they're doing now, but do it on a more local basis, which is really what we need to ask for. So when I said that to them, it was very interesting. It was obvious to me they'd never thought of that question. And they probably came up with, 10 answers after they left. But they couldn't think of a very good one right out of the box, and I think that was significant. Other than defense, and I agree with that. I do. I agree with that. That's what the federal government is there for the most part. This is interpretation again, and it just demonstrates how they do not believe that the statute dictates what they can do. Joe Goffman is the US EPA's law whisperer. His specialty is teaching an old law to do new tricks. We don't teach old laws to do new tricks. You want a new law, you go get a new law. But you don't do this. He is gearing up the 1970 Clean Air Act to be the vehicle for curbing power plants' greenhouse gas emissions. But with no congressional action likely anytime soon to address climate change, he is back at the EPA to help shape a new rule for working power plant fleets under a rarely used section of the Clean Air Act. He has a sense of vocation to the Clean Air Act. He has been working on the law and its associated regulations for 30 years, often focusing on problems that were not envisioned in the original law and thus require new tools. If it wasn't envisioned in the new law, or in the law, you can't do it. You don't get to make this up. There is a reason why there was a law in 1849 that we may not have used in 1923. We evolve. Our congressional representatives evolve. We pass laws as it is necessary to deal with them. Right now, you look at what they're trying to do with the internet. They're using a law from the 1930s, an antitrust law, in an effort to regulate and control the internet because they know Congress isn't going to let them do that. You know, the people who are doing that, I think, ought to be arrested. Maybe I'm being a little wild with that. They don't get to do that. That's wrong. This is it. President Obama issued 145 midnight regulations, they costed $21 billion between November 8th and December 31st. $21 billion of new midnight regulations, including 31 economically significant ones, 4.5 new rules a day in that 6-week period. EPA regulation of carbon, 2015 to 2016, 2026, the average annual impact would be more than 500,000 jobs and cost $7 trillion, and there will be no significant impact on reducing global greenhouse gas emission growth. Obama tries to destroy Peabody. And this is something I think is interesting. The EPA added $312 billion in costs along with 30 million hours of additional paperwork to keep up with the regulations, just to try to destroy coal. The Supreme Court issued a stay against that particular regulation. The so-called Clean Power Plan at a cost of $7.2 billion a year. And it will, according to the EPA's website, quote, the EPA does not anticipate that this proposed rule will result in notable CO2 emission changes. They're going to drop a rule on us that costs $7.2 billion a year, and they admit it will have no positive benefit. Now, that's insanity. Here's the cost of the Paris Climate Accord. If every nation adhered to its commitments by 2030, the only difference in global warming by the end of the century will be to reduce the world's temperature by 0.048 degrees Celsius. That is 1/20th of a degree. Estimated cost, $1.5 trillion. I posted some updated information yesterday. The S&P Global Markets new report puts the price at $5.2 trillion. Of the 189 companies that have submitted information, only 60 have included specific financial estimates, so they know it will be substantially in excess of $5 trillion. They think that they will be able to reduce the degrees by 0.2 degrees Celsius if everybody complies with the Paris Climate Accord. Stanford University projects the Paris Accord to cost $58 trillion over the next 25 years, and the Energy Transition Commission estimates $15 trillion, with Bloomberg another $12.7 trillion. So the numbers are kind of all over the board, but none of them are good. Trillions of dollars to have absolutely no impact whatsoever. Europe's folly. The Germany electricity prices are triple those paid in the United States. In Australia, electricity rates skyrocketed from $100 a megawatt hour to $10,000 a megawatt hour. We're talking about energy poverty here. Energy poverty. You go to those countries and you see the amount of money that they spend to heat their homes or cool their homes is absolutely astronomical compared to what we pay. This is about redistribution of money. That's all that this is about. European Union spent $750 billion on green energy handouts in the last decade, and all it has bought them is double the power costs. But you know, overregulation is not just monetary. And one of them that is very personal to me, and everybody in Wyoming really, is that the regulations have been so destructive of our national forests. The roadless rule was adopted in 2001. It was one of the very last things that Bill Clinton did. It was designed to deny access, management, and use to 58.5 million acres. I was hired by the state of Wyoming to file a lawsuit against the Forest Service, and we did that in 2001. And in that process, I was able to get the administrative record related to that rulemaking, and at the time it was the largest rulemaking in U.S. history. So I received 56 CDs worth of data, information, and documents, and then had to comb through those to find things that would be helpful to show that the roadless rule was illegal. And the roadless rule was illegal as all get out. One of the things that happened was in 1999 and in 2000, there were 2 GAO reports that were issued. And they talked about forest health. One of the things that's very significant is that they talked about the risks associated with adopting the roadless rule because there would be no treatment. There would be no ability to protect our environment in roadless areas. There's 192 million National Forest Service lands, and this denied management, access, and use to almost 60 million acres. 5.5 of which were road and roadless areas, but I won't go into that. Anyway, this is where you all come in. This is what happened. This was reported. It was interesting, the local Forest Service employees were very against the roadless rule because they said it's going to prevent them from managing this resource the way it should be managed. Officials on several national forests included in our review voiced concerns about the long-term impacts of the roadless rule. Officials on the Route National Forest, and the Route National Forest is just south of the Wyoming state line. It's contiguous with the Medicine Bow National Forest in Wyoming. Officials on the Route National Forest anticipate an outbreak of pine beetles resulting from a catastrophic windstorm in 1997 that felled 13,000 acres of mostly spruce and fir trees in or adjacent to roadless areas on the forest. They believe that the preferred alternative would not allow them to construct the roads necessary to remove trees in roadless areas that in the future may become infected by beetles currently living within this deadfall. Therefore, they would be unable to protect highly valued resources such as scenic areas and adjacent campgrounds and ski slopes. That roadless area, or that area where that blowdown was in a wilderness area surrounded by a roadless area. And as a result, they did not go in and treat it. That is ground zero for the pine beetle outbreak. That's where it came from. And the Forest Service knew it. And the Forest Service has destroyed our national forests as a result. You look across our national forests, you look at our national parks, we are never in our lifetime going to see a recovery of our national forests. They've destroyed our logging industry. They've destroyed waterways. We've had horrific, catastrophic forest fires. Montana burned down this summer, and it was because of mismanagement of National Forest Service lands. One of the things that I take with me is this book. It's called Exploring with Custer. And what they did is they took the historical photographs, and then they went back to the same locations later, more modern day, and took photographs of those areas. And what you see is pre-settlement natural conditions versus overgrowth. And this photo, there's probably 40, 50 pages in here. It is astounding to see how overgrown and monolithic and unhealthy our forests are now as compared to the natural conditions prior to Forest Service management. So when people ask why I'm against the or why I dislike the federal government, I don't dislike the federal government, but I really dislike this. I really dislike what they've done to our national forest. I really dislike what they've done to our resources. This is the reason why. That's what the roadless rule did. This is what the roadless rule is responsible for the disasters that we've seen. We were arguing that case one day, and the U.S. Attorney from Washington, D.C. was responding when I was talking about the sea of red and now the sea of debt, what we see in our national forest. And she stood up and she said, we recognize that the roadless rule will be ecologically devastating to certain areas. But we believe it is more important to have one rule coming out of Washington, D.C. dictating management than to worry about isolated areas. The state of Wyoming was an isolated area. 3.2 million acres of roadless lands in the state of Wyoming, and we were isolated. Those lands weren't significant enough to protect. So it isn't just financial. It is, again, mismanagement, and that's what I see over and over again. And as I said, the Forest Service employees did not want the roadless rule. That came out of D.C. In August of 2016, the Forest Service warns that it is at a tipping point of a crisis dealing with escalating wildfires and disease. There were 10 million acres torched in 2015. They blame everything on global warming. In September of 2017, there were over 550,000 acres burned in Oregon alone at a cost of $238 million. The Sequoia Forest National Monument status may result in burning it to the ground. There is no money for maintenance and vegetation management. There is an $11 billion backlog for road maintenance in the Forest Service. But this is what has happened. There are mounting pressures to restrain spending. Budgets can incentivize lawmakers to impose off-budget regulations on the private sector rather than unpopular deficit spending. Unlike on-budget spending, the regulatory costs remain largely hidden from public view, a feature that can make regulation overly attractive to lawmakers. What I see is that I think that the regulatory burden has previously remained largely unrecognized. People are waking up. I've been traveling the United States pretty extensively talking and trying to get this information out there. I think that these regulatory burdens, as I talked about, are creating fuel poverty. Our ability to protect our environment is absolutely dependent upon our economic prosperity. Go to a former Soviet republic. Kid, I know that you've traveled extensively. Look at what we found out about Romania in 1989 after Ceausescu fell. Those countries that don't have freedom and liberty, those countries that are not economically prosperous, they don't care about their environment. They can't. They don't have the ability. We have to have a balance in this or we can't protect our environment. There are 4 executive orders that were issued by President Trump. Comprehensive plan for reorganization of the executive branch. These are all regulatory reform. If he were successful in getting these through, it would be the most significant part of his presidency. I will say that I think that what is going on in D.C., I think the chaos is absolutely intended to prevent this type of regulatory reform from going forward. But it is critical. The House passed the Midnight Rules Relief Act. That's something that Congress needs to do. Our Senate is not taking up bills that the Senate needs to take up. That is one of the real problems that we have, is the Senate is not doing its job. We need to make Congress answerable to the voters. They need to pass the REINS Act. Congress has passed it repeatedly. The Secretary won't take it up. It prevents any significant new regulation from taking effect unless it is ratified by each House of Congress. It would force Congress to do its job and it would get rid of regulations immediately. But the Senate won't take it up. The House has passed it. Here's something I've been working with, and that is the regulation of freedom. I've been working with the Madison Coalition. We're looking at a constitutional amendment. Whenever 1/4 of the members of the U.S. House or the U.S. Senate transmit to the President the written declaration of opposition to a proposed federal regulation, it shall require a majority vote of the House and Senate to adopt that regulation. That would be a really good constitutional amendment. I'd tolerate a statute if we could even get that passed as a statute. That's the Madison Coalition. If you want to go to their website and read more about it. What you can do, you need to demand that our governors take action. Our governors should be the ones that protect our citizens. That should be their #1 responsibility, is our governors need to protect the citizens from outside forces, including the federal government. We need to be demanding that our governors push back against the federal government and not allow them to come in and persecute our landowners and our citizens the way they've been historically doing. We need tax reform, and then tax reform, and then tax reform, and then more tax reform, and then more tax reform after that. Tax reform is critical. I'm not talking about on the margins. I'm talking about a fundamentally different way of viewing how we, that the power in Washington, D.C. versus at the state level. We need to starve that beast. And that's what makes me so mad about the debate that's going on in Congress right now. They're trying to protect everything. They're trying to protect all their spending. This is the opportunity for tax reform to starve the beast. And they're not taking that opportunity, and it's very frustrating for everybody from what I can tell. So that's an issue there. As Winston Churchill said, if you have 10,000 regulations, you destroy all respect for the law. And I think that that is very, very true. So that is the end of my presentation. I'd be happy to answer questions that you may have. Yes, ma'am.
Hey, I wanted to ask you, since you're talking about responsibility for our government, I can tell you as somebody who watches day in and day out of the hearings, whether it be Ways and Means, and by the way, we had a great victory today. They're gonna keep the inheritance tax. They're repealing it. So if you want to leave your business to your kids, you're not going to have to pay taxes on it. If you want to leave your farm to your kids, you won't have to sell 2/3 of the farm so that the government gets 45%. So this is good as long as it stays in the bill. This was one of the things that President Trump has ran on and has pushed. And if they try to pull it out, it was a big debate. I posted it online today. I put we do have really good Republicans, guys. Don't let the Democrats fool you on what they're telling you in the news. I would suggest you turn your TVs off. Secondly, I know I just got my bill for health care. Come January, instead of paying $1,600, I'm going to pay $2,600 a month for health care for my husband and myself. And thirdly, I hate to break the news to everybody, but states don't want their power back, because then they cannot no longer blame the federal government. It's like when you go to your county meeting or your city meeting, and they say, "Oh, well, that's federal regulatory. We can't do anything about it." The states are afraid to take the power back for the loss of the vote, for actually taking care of their own business. And I'm calling a lot of our congressmen and our governors out on this right now. You always say that you want the power back to the states. Prove it. Put up or shut up. What would you say if I asked you about some of the ethanol? Okay, this is another big regulatory deal that we're using our corn to put in our vehicles. Well, I can tell you, as somebody in the trucking industry, I wouldn't put a gallon of ethanol in my cow, let alone my car. It rots all your hoses. You don't want to put it in your boats. You don't want to put it in anything else. I'm sorry for the Iowa farmers who think that corn is fuel, but it's not. So, I don't know. Any of that you can pick up on?
Sure, I will comment on that. I tend to believe that the free market system and capitalism is one of the healthiest forms of government and economic foundation that you can have. I also don't believe that you compromise your food supply by putting it into your energy chain. I think that there has been, the boondoggle with that is that Iowa is the first caucus. And when you go back and you look at ethanol and you look at all of that, it's political again. I have dealt with ethanol plants because I practice in Nebraska as well. And do
well, that's the reason I asked you. I knew you did.
And do some water down there. The farmers and ranchers will adjust. The farmers will adjust in terms of not having an ethanol subsidy. I
Well,
don't,
wouldn't you think that if we're gonna open up trade like with Japan now, and it seems like Trump's doing a pretty good job over in China, the news doesn't want to cover a lot of it because he was more welcome than Obama was. And he's telling them, you know, we got to get on an even keel. So we're going to be able to export not only our corn, but our beef. Minnesota and Michigan, which has a lot of cow farmers and stuff, they'll be able to export milk products. I mean, if we would just give our president a little more time and let's weed out these fake rhinos, I think we're going to come out on this on the long run in a pretty good way in about 2 years.
yeah, and are there any other comments or questions? Yes, Tommy?
Two parts. Who's the debt owed to? And isn't the real reason that they don't care about the debt because the monetary system and the Fed is nothing but a Ponzi scheme?
Yeah.
That was simple.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the debt is owed to a variety of people, you know.
Well,
and
China's
I know
got
that
the biggest
Bob
debt.
and Kathy can talk about monetary policy and what has been going on with the Fed for a long, long time. It's something that Rand Paul and Ron Paul have talked about. And yes, that is part of it. But there is a real debt out there. They are borrowing money to pay these bills.
From who?
China.
From,
Well, look at the uranium,
What's China gonna do
Nevada.
to pay them back?
Take
Nothing. What can they do?
well, one of the issues that you have with a $20 trillion debt is that there's very little, it's almost impossible to pay back. You either have to inflate your way out of it, or you have to default. And those are the options of where we're headed. And I look at what's going on in Congress, as I said, I cannot figure out why they are not taking this opportunity to really fundamentally restructure the federal government. But it's their power base too. I get that. I understand it. That's why it's the governors who are going to have to be the ones that fight the battle. Yes, sir.
To narrow down to our state, I'd like to raise a question. Chuck knows this better than I do. I've heard some discussion about that the DOT in Wyoming, that we don't even see their budget or some of the rules. Is that right, Chuck?
Well, it's
What is it?
off the general fund.
Yeah.
So they moved it just to fees, the general fund, so there's less accountability on it.
So, how do we, and I hear that some people in the Senate can't even get to that. How is that a department in the state of Wyoming is kind of a rogue?
You know, it really comes down to leadership. It does. And I think that I was looking at a memo today that someone sent to me and talked about the need for transparency. And I think one of the reasons why there is frustration with our government and a distrust with our government, and perhaps some of what we're seeing play out across the country, is that people they are not trusting the government. They don't believe that the government has their best interests in mind. And then you read about these transactions that are taking place. I mean, the graft and corruption in Washington, D.C. has everybody shaking their heads. I'm not saying that it's at that level in our Department of Transportation here in Wyoming, but I think one of the things that a government must do in order to be accountable to the citizens that it is required to serve is to be transparent about finances, budgeting, number of employees, agencies. If you've got a hiring freeze, actually have a hiring freeze. Don't try to reclassify people so that it looks like there's a hiring freeze, but you're actually giving people raises. Don't do things like that. I think that is the message that I've been hearing pretty loud, is that they don't think that the government is being honest with them. And
Oh, gee.
what are all the answers to that? You know, Chuck's in the legislature, and I think that he probably has some frustration with what he deals with. I think it's compounded, you know, 100-fold or 1,000-fold or 1,000,000-fold in Washington, D.C. But even at our state level, accountability is what people want. They want transparency. They want honesty. people are willing to work with their leaders to find solutions to problems. They're willing to make sacrifices if it makes sense to make sacrifices. I travel the country, I talk with people like you all the time. I find people to be pretty rational. I trust the people I talk to. I'm not sure that our leaders always do, and I think we need to get back to that. Yes?
Okay, I have a twofold question. So, how, I mean, wouldn't it be just like the stroke of a pen for a governor to just say goodbye, federal people, get out of our face? Or it's just a threefold question. Would it actually save us money, even though we're not getting all this, you know, the handouts, because now we don't have strings attached to this free money? And would you be the governor to do it?
What was that third one? It isn't that simple. I wish that it were, but we have what's called primacy. And so even in our own Constitution, it acknowledges that there is the federal law and there is a federal Constitution. So we have to be cognizant of that. Where I think that you fight those battles is one of the ways. There's a variety of ways to do it. Again, there is a resolution, the Western Governors Association, and I don't have it in here with me, but the Western Governors Association has actually adopted a resolution that's really good about that federal-state relationship. But that's all it is it's a piece of paper that's a resolution that says, we want more power, feds leave us alone. It doesn't go anywhere. Nobody does anything with it. They need to take that resolution, and we need to be fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting and fighting. There are 50 governors in this country, and those 50 governors have a lot more power than they think that they do. And those governors are the ones that do need to push back against the federal agencies and said, you're not doing that in our state. In my case with my gentleman who moved the irrigation ditch, I went to the Attorney General's office and I went to the state engineer's office. I said, this is a test case. It's out in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing out here. They are trying to take jurisdiction over water quantity using the water quality statutes. The state needs to get involved in this lawsuit. And they said, this is between the EPA and a private citizen. This has nothing to do with us. And that was a mistake. I have since been told they would perhaps take a different position now. I don't know. But that's one of the areas where I think that the state starts stepping up and backstopping its citizens and saying, EPA, you want to come in and mess with our folks, you're going to have to go through me first. And I think that you would see a very different EPA approach to our landowners in the state of Wyoming. So that's one of the ways that I think we can do that. Our state government, our governor needs to protect the citizens. And that's, like I said, that's one of the ways to do it, and I can give you more examples like that. Wyoming, with our energy resources, we have an outsized power, but we don't exercise it. The federal government, the other states are dependent upon our energy. We know that they're dependent upon our energy.
40%.
We need to start exercising our authority and the power we have. And I think that we do that by just like what I'm saying. You call the folks in from the EPA and you say, you're not doing this anymore in my state. You're just not. And I hate to use this example, you know, and other states have done it. Other states have done it with other ways. They've done it with the marijuana laws. They just said, we're not going to follow federal law. I mean, there are examples. We have the ability to fight back on some of this, but we have to have the will to do it. We have to have the support of the citizens to do it. We have to have an educated citizenry. And when you say we would have to give up that money, no, that money's ours. We need to start demanding that money is block granted back to the states. If it goes to the feds at all, it's block granted and we get to do our priorities. Those signs, those electronic billboards across the highways, those were paid for by the Federal Department of Transportation. It's my understanding they were close to $1 million a pop. How many of them do we have across the state? 20 of them?
2 minutes.
25? So as you drive across the state, you get nagged the entire way. Slow down.
The roads are wet.
Click it or take it. You know, stop yelling at me. It's windy. It's windy? Oh, okay. Yeah, right. All right, $1 million a pop. Would anybody in here have prioritized electronic billboards for $20 million? No. Had that money come to the state of Wyoming, we could use it for opioid addiction. We could use it for mental health issues. We could look at different ways of funding education. I mean, that money is dictated. We don't get to prioritize how we want to spend the money because Washington, D.C. is dictating we have to put up stupid signs.
Well, that's weak senators.
And yes, but
It's
that's,
weak
those
senators.
are examples. Those are examples.
It's weak senators. I
Yes,
watch our
yes.
senator all the time. Both of them are
When you
useless.
said, you're right, our state constitution recognizes the U.S. Constitution as supreme law, but it doesn't recognize the regulations, does it?
No, it doesn't, and you're absolutely right. And that's one of the battles. I have a book here. Oh, I won't bore you with it. Oh, I mean, just look at this thing. It's little tiny print. And this guy has documented everything you need to know about administrative law, which is what regulations are. Administrative law is unconstitutional. He goes back, they've been trying to do this since, I think, the 600s, where this is how kings get absolute power. And that's why it's so contrary to a constitutional republic like what we have in the United States and the state of Wyoming. We have the wherewithal to battle this. We just haven't done it. And you know, it's one of those things that it just creeps up. A lot of people just don't even know this is out there. You just don't realize why we have this horrific federal weight on our backs that is just weighing us down. You don't know why. You had a question.
So on the Clean Water Act, you talked about the fine. Did the courts give the EPA the ability to fine at, what, $37,000 a day?
Congress did.
Congress did, okay. So if you guys would have lost your case and he would have had a judgment or a lien, I don't know how they would have done that, could they have foreclosed and taken that man's property?
Yes.
That's a big deal, because what are they doing with the property that they're taking? Have they been
Look at the
successful?
Bundys. I mean, it's all over uranium.
Here's what they do. This is the way, I truly believe that if you give an agency or anybody the authority to fine somebody $37,500 a day, you've created a totalitarian government, okay? You know, and as they say, I guess I would say these regulators are, every one of them have a totalitarian screaming to get out, because really that's the way, what this is about. $37,500, when you get your letter, when you get your notice of violation, it says, you violated the Clean Water Act, you put fill material in a navigable water of the United States, you are subject to fines of $37,500 a day. You have 10 days to notify us as to whether you're going to comply and address this situation. Okay, you're a farmer, you're a rancher, you're a hotel owner, you're a house builder, you've just had a heart attack and you're dead on the floor. So what you do is, sometimes you call people like me, or you call the EPA and say, I'll do whatever it takes. And they say, well, how much money do you have? Give us all your tax returns for the last 5 years and your bank accounts, and we'll look at it. And if you're not wealthy, we'll fine you $5,000 bucks. But what they do is they make them consent decrees. So it's not just a settlement agreement between you and the EPA. It becomes a consent decree. It's filed with the court, approved by the court, and your agreement becomes precedent against him. So what they do is they take these little tiny test cases that they'll say, well, we'll only fine you $2,000, or we'll only fine you $8,000 after they've given you the heart attack, because they have 5 years to bring the lawsuit. And that's how long they took. They filed the lawsuit the day before the statute of limitations ran on my case. 5 years, $37,500 a day. So then they settle, and what they were seeking in that particular case was $500,000, or no, yeah, 500,000. They ultimately came back at trial. We didn't have to go to the damages phase because I won on liability. The jury ruled in our favor on liability and said my client hadn't violated the Clean Water Act. But that's what they do, is then these cases become precedent and they're enforced against other people. So that's this whole sue and settle thing. That's another thing that they've been doing, that Scott Pruitt last week said we're not going to have any more sue and settle stuff coming out of the EPA. That was another way they were doing it. They were entering into consent decrees where everybody was sitting on the same side of the table that was involved in it, and the American public was on the other side, and it was the American public that was getting cheated out of everything. But that's, yes, they'll take your property. And in fact, that's what they do. They'll target people if they have a particular piece of property that they want. They target.
What do they do with that property, you know?
They keep it. The federal government, these environmental groups, they like amassing more and more real property. They do. They will keep it, they will sell it. There is not a lot of political support for the federal government going out and buying property. Shouldn't, especially in a state like Wyoming where 45% of our surface estate is already
That's
owned by
what
the
the county
feds.
tried to do to me.
So that's one of the ways in which they take property.
But wouldn't the state fight back on that? Because if the government comes in and takes the property through a bureaucracy, then the state's no longer getting property tax, or the counties aren't getting property tax on it.
We should.
So the
That's
state should be curious about it.
But that's another thing that we should be fighting. Absolutely, I agree with you. There are a lot of things the feds do in terms of real property rights that's a time for another discussion, that the states need to be pushing back on because it's substantially impacting our property tax base and will into perpetuity.
So then why didn't Griedenthal step in and talk about that? Sorry.
Well, Michelle, it's the same thing the county tried to do to me. $585,000 in fines for my car. They thought I was the test case. And then when I kicked their ass, they backed off a lot of other people. And we set a state precedent. Grandfathering is alive and well in Wyoming. Thank you very much.
I had another question right over here.
We've been looking at a lot of little pictures, but the big picture is, the national debt. And you said something a little bit ago about what if we default on that loan? By definition, when you default on that loan, that's pretty much everything that we fight for and live for, even the Constitution goes away.
I don't know. I would fight against that. That's part of why we have our state individual constitutions and our own state identity.
Because it's kind of like your land. If you default on your land, they take it away from you.
Yep.
Those are some of the very scary discussions and some of the very scary questions when you're looking at $20 trillion in debt. $20 trillion in debt is a real number, and it's not a good one. And as I said, it's covered up a lot of really bad policy decisions out of Washington, D.C. And maybe they're equally as bad, but we are being impacted by those bad decisions. I mean, my goodness gracious, looking at the fines or the cost of the Paris Climate Accord, $58 trillion over 25 years. Who in their right mind would think that would make sense? If you could take that $58 trillion and what you could do around the world to end poverty, to bring energy and electricity to rural areas, the things that you could do with that to improve everyone's standard of living, I mean, you could do that for probably 1/10 of it.
It's the same thing with the wind towers and green energy. We're one of the most abundant coal, oil, and gas, and here we're worried about some bird blenders?
Yeah, and I agree. This gentleman has had some questions as well.
The answer is to repeal Congress's constitutional authority to borrow money. We need a constitutional amendment that simply wipes that out.
Yeah, and I don't disagree. I don't disagree. Yes, sir.
It may be a stretch of an analogy, but I see a parallel, more of an alteration than anything, between the credit system. It's more fun to maintain the credit because interest goes on forever. Once you eliminate a debt, it stops. So there is no end point to what we see here. There is no profit to be gained. So
there's no profit to be gained by the powers that be.
I concur with you. The key to it is to eliminate the funding.
We got to starve that beast. We've got to starve that beast. $4 trillion. Do you realize it was less than 20 years ago that it was $1 trillion, in spending, and we're now at $4 trillion. That's just such an astounding.
Thanks, Obamacare.
And it's insufficient.
It's incomprehensible.
It's incomprehensible. It really is. Yes, ma'am.
Can we get you to run for governor?
That's something
that's not a no.
That's something that's being discussed. Yes. I think that we need to have a strong governor. I do. I feel that Wyoming could be a leader in the country on these issues, on a variety of things. And so it is something that I've been looking to.
Good. Harriet, put on your governor's hat for a minute, since just before we elect you. And, when the Supreme Court ruled that every state had to recognize same-sex marriage, I wrote a column and I criticized the governor for folding like a cheap tent. Now, I want to know, could you, and I said, he could have ordered every clerk in the state of Wyoming to not recognize same-sex marriage and tell the Supreme Court, do what you want about it. Your reply.
You know, I don't know that I have an answer for that right now. I really don't, because one of the things that I do believe in is the rule of law, and what the Supreme Court did was, I agree with you, was wrong. You can't create constitutional rights out of whole cloth. They did it with Roe versus Wade, and we have been in a battle over that for how many years now? The Supreme Court never should have stepped into those kinds of social issues. I would like to talk to you about what you were looking at in that regard. I'm at the very beginning of this process right now. There's a lot that I need to learn and a lot more research and investigation I need to do on these things.
Well, for me, I was just wondering, do you think, let's say he
one of the things I'll tell you that I would have done, I would make sure that people that we would protect the religious liberty of the citizens of the state of Wyoming. I absolutely believe that, and if you go to our Constitution, it's very, very, very clear that we all have that religious liberty. If you look at right here, Article 1, Section 18 of the Wyoming Constitution, it states, the free exercise and enjoyment of religious profession and worship without discrimination or preferences shall be forever guaranteed in this state, and no person shall be rendered incompetent to hold any office of trust or profit, or to serve as a witness or juror because of his opinion on any matter of religious belief, whatever. But the liberty of conscience hereby secured shall not be so construed as to excuse acts of licentiousness or justify practices inconsistent with the peace or safety of the state. We have a very strong religious liberty that is in our Constitution, and that was something that I thought that our governor should have taken a stand on, and especially in light of what's happened with the woman up in Sublette County.
Right.
So I believe, and there's also freedom of speech. There's a variety of our own constitutional provisions that I think that we should have looked at more closely in terms of addressing what the Supreme Court did.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
In terms of the law of the land, Article 3, Section 2, Clause 2 of the Constitution gives Congress the absolute authority to determine federal judicial appellate jurisdiction. Congress tomorrow could wipe out the homosexual marriage decision by simply saying family law is hereby blocked out of the federal judiciary and no prior decisions may be used as precedents. Congress can do it in one day. That's the rule of law. Now Congress won't.
That's right.
I was talking to Senator Barrasso about that last week, face to face. Told him he could be a constitutional hero. No commitment at all. He is not a constitutional hero. He's a pragmatist. But Congress can do it. And the Federalist, number 80, last paragraph by Alexander Hamilton comes on really strong for that. That's the answer. We need to get the federal judiciary under control.
I agree with you.
They're absolutely crazy.
That's why if you take the power out of Washington, D.C. and you return it to the states, that it is our state courts that are making those decisions. The idea that the federal government and the federal Supreme Court is addressing an issue like that is absolutely abhorrent to me. It is because of what this is. This is the Constitution that is to be addressed to those issues. And as we all know, any power that is not specifically, the federal government simply does not have the power to make those kinds of decisions. But I mean, we're living through some very strange times right now. We're living through some very strange times because we're not living by this document anymore.
The inmates are running the asylum.
That's a better way of putting it. Yes, sir.
In your presentation, I think you were talking about the neglect of the Forest Service or of taking care of our property, federal property. Well, I think it's federal property. But I think there's a limitation on the Constitution as to what property the federal government can have. Can you help me understand the relationship between Wyoming and all that federal land? And is there a trust relationship that they will take care of that property?
No,
They pretend so, but not really.
What it is that the federal government through the BLM and the Forest Service, primarily, those are your two big agencies, and your National Park Service being a third one, they own property. They own property in the majority of the states, whereas west of the Mississippi, they own a lot more property than they do east of the Mississippi. And so Nevada...
100th meridian, not the Mississippi.
Okay, the 100th meridian. I kind of use that as my, because the maps that I...
It's not correct.
Yes. But they own property in the western states, and they manage it through those agencies.
Is that constitutional? I thought there were limitations on what the federal government could own, provided it was constitutional.
When has the federal government followed the Constitution in the last 120 years or so?
The 1897 Organic Act created the National Forest Service. It's created the National Forest Service and identified 192 million acres that were to be put into the National Forest bucket, if you will. When they did that, they put that agency within the Department of Agriculture, the USDA, not the Department of Interior. And the reason they did that is because they anticipated, Congress, when they created it, they intended that these lands were to be managed, that the Forest Service lands were to provide a continuous supply of timber and a continuous supply of water. What has happened over the last 40 years especially is they have completely gone away from their original mission, and they now treat those lands like they are National Park Service lands, which is absolutely a violation of the law. It's a violation of the Organic Act. It's the violation of the reason for which the forest lands were created. The problem that you have is you have federal district court judges and appellate court judges and Supreme Court judges who have bought into the environmental preservation at all cost mentality. No. And that's where we've gotten a lot of the decisions, such as the Chevron decision that came out in 1983 that gave them even more power to the agencies. I mean, I can talk about that for a long, long time. Can we go in and get a federal district court judge to say they can't own any property? Probably not. But what we can do is, again, push back on their inability to manage them or their refusal to manage them. Start asking to do pilot projects. I mean, there's a variety of things that you can do in terms of that relationship. I just think that our governors have started to become, again, viewing themselves as being kind of an arm of the federal government, and that's the mentality that needs to be changed.
Would it be possible to use something like a writ of mandamus to make them perform the responsibilities that they have?
Writ of mandamus is going to go through a federal district court judge.
But wouldn't that be an appropriate way? I mean, that's one way to make people do what they're supposed to do, right? For example,
got to convince the judge first.
We turn criminals loose because you don't have adequate room for them.
Right.
Well, if they're not going to take care of the property, then they shouldn't have it.
You've got to convince a federal district court judge of what you've said. Now, do I think that that's an impossibility? No. Do I think that it is worth looking at a variety of solutions to these? Yes, I do. I just find that federal district court judges anymore are oftentimes federal employees first. That's, yes, ma'am.
Just in case you were to happen to decide to run for governor, would you object to us passing around a sheet for people to sign up as
I would love that.
As volunteers?
Yes, I would love to have contact information. Okay. If people are willing to give me their name and address and contact information, that would be very, very helpful to me. Okay. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I've watched government extensively for several years, and what I see happening over and over and over again is Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, the comprehensive land.
Yep.
And also, especially it's both city council and county commission, but they agreed to accept international regulations. And then after this is implemented, then in those sessions, it's continually implemented. And I'm sure it's even budgeted. And so with your mindset on educating the electorate and helping the electorate know where to go to push back on some of this.
The governor needs to be pushing back on that.
Oh, really?
The
You mean
governor
like
needs to be
international
pushing back on
codes,
the
Linda?
UN mandates. The governor needs to be involved in Agenda 21 and pushing back against those things, and the sustainability movement and all of those. The governor needs to have advisors that are very, very, very well educated in how the UN is attempting to again infiltrate our constitutional republic and impose the international law. The Endangered Species Act came from that. And we need to, those are some of the issues that we are seeing. I mean, so much of what we're seeing that has happened with this administration since January is because of the globalism concept. And so, you know, all of these need to be fought at the state level. The legislature needs to fight these issues, the governor needs to fight these issues. They need to be exposed. We need to be honest about what the purpose behind these organizations are and these efforts are. We need to expose them, we need to disclose them. And the people can make the decision that that's how they want to be governed. But, yes, sir.
A lot of people think that things have gone too far. The problem is too immense dealing with the voting. What are your thoughts about Article 5 in these states?
A little louder.
My thoughts on the Article 5 Convention of the States. You know, I don't know that I'm prepared to give you a position on that. I've got people who talk to me from both sides on it. I think that there are some aspects that it's the way that our Constitution can be amended. That's one of the ways in which our Constitution can be amended. It is something that I need to get more information about, and I'm just not ready to take a position, a public position on that yet.
Don't you think we ought to try using the Constitution before we start monkeying around?
You mean implement what we already have? And there is some truth to that. But what we've talked about is the constitutional amendments that I think are appropriate are the ones like reigning in this regulatory state. Although this gentleman right here, Philip Hamburger, will tell you that it's already in the Constitution. So anyway, I think that we're getting close to done here. I appreciate. Do you have a question?
Harriet, I would just say that until you eliminate the Federal Reserve, it doesn't matter if you have any kind of constitution of convention that balances the budget, because right now they're spending money that hasn't been appropriated. They've been doing it since 1917. So to say that if we just had a balanced budget amendment, it would change things. Until you get rid of the Federal Reserve, it doesn't matter. Because they're just the way you're talking about. They are totally autonomous. They're not even a federal.
They're not accountable. That's right. That is right. So, thank you.
Feel free to stay and then ask her any more questions that you might have. I just want to make sure that everybody, if you did leave at 8:30, that you're able to. One other thing, I'd like to recognize some of our state legislators that we have here. Former state legislator Bob Brechtel is here. Kit Jennings is here. And currently, Representative Chuck.
Next Thursday I've got a town hall at Pizza Ranch.
Thursday or Tuesday?
Thursday.
Thursday.
We moved it, it's Thursday. Sorry about that.
Okay.
And then in December there'll be one on the second Tuesday. So, and that's at 6 p.m. So anyway, if anyone wants to come to that, thanks.
So that's a week from tonight, huh?
Yes.